Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an expert's analysis of how a single regional conflict could, and I mean really could, threaten the entire planet. We're talking about a kind of vulnerability in our global system that, honestly, most of us have probably never even thought about.
It seems like a crazy question, right? How can one thing lead to all that? Well, according to the analysis we're looking at, the answer isn't just oil. It's about a few other critical materials that all have to pass through one incredibly narrow strip of water. Okay, let's get into it.
So the whole argument we're exploring today really comes down to one single geographic linchpin, the Strait of Hormuz. Pretty much everything we're about to talk about, from the fuel for our cars to the phone in your hand, has to get through this one tiny corridor.
I mean, just think about that for a second. This strait is the only sea route out of the Persian Gulf. That fact alone makes it one of the most strategic and, as you're about to see, one of the most fragile spots on the entire planet.
And here's why it's so fragile. At its narrowest point, that shipping lane is just 21 kilometers. That's about 13 miles wide. That is an absurdly small gap for the world's commercial arteries to squeeze through. It also makes it dangerously easy to blockade. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Everybody, and I mean everybody, focuses on the oil. But the expert in our source material says to look closer at the other stuff. We're talking about 20% of the world's liquid natural gas, 20% of its fertilizer, and a whopping 30% of all helium. These are huge numbers, and as we're about to see, they're way too big to just brush aside. So how exactly does a bottleneck in one little strait affect your day-to-day life? Well, the expert lays out this terrifying domino effect that starts with a simple blockade and ends right in your kitchen and in your pocket. And there it is. The first domino tips over. One single action in one small part of the world kicks off a chain reaction that's going to have consequences for everybody.
So, first, you lose a massive chunk of the world's helium supply, which comes from right there. And helium isn't just for party balloons, not even close. It is absolutely positively essential for making semiconductors. You know, the tiny brains inside all of our electronics. There is literally no substitute for it.
And the ripple effect here is just immediate and devastating. No helium means you can't make the chips. And if you can't make the chips, production of almost every piece of modern electronics would just stop.
And this quote just perfectly captures how fast this crisis would hit. The expert in our source points out this wild fact. You can't just store helium for a rainy day. It literally leaks out of any container you put it in. So the moment that supply gets cut off, the global impact would be almost instantaneous. But you know, this goes so much deeper than our gadgets. The expert highlights an even more basic, more fundamental threat. That same strait is the pipeline for about 20% of the world's fertilizer, which happens to be a byproduct of all the oil and gas refining they do in that region.
A loss of that size, it's never happened before on a global scale. We're talking about taking 1/5 of the entire world's food supply and just wiping it off the map, almost overnight.
So the expert's conclusion is pretty stark, and you can't really argue with it. This isn't just some regional food crisis. This is a global one, a famine that would hit every single country on Earth in just a matter of months.
Okay, so with the stakes this incredibly high, how does something like this even end? The expert we're looking at outlines 5 possible and, frankly, deeply unsettling scenarios.
Now, it's really important to say this is the expert's specific analysis of how this could all play out. The possibilities range from a direct military fight to retaliatory strikes that could make the entire Gulf region uninhabitable, all the way to the terrifying idea of nuclear war. Now, according to the source, the most likely outcome is actually number 4, that Iran would try to disable Israel's nuclear weapons to stop things from escalating. It really shows you the kind of high-stakes, technological chess game that's at the very heart of this conflict.
To even begin to understand these endgames, you have to look at the history here, the long-standing tensions. The expert in our source argues that what's happening isn't really new. It's more like the boiling point of decades of strategy and mistrust between all the key players.
So, what's the big takeaway from all of this pretty alarming analysis? What are we supposed to learn from a potential crisis that's this huge?
The expert argues that we're fundamentally looking at this problem the wrong way. We tend to focus on the politics of it all, right, and the price of gas. But in doing that, we're completely missing the much, much bigger story. The collapse of the supply chain that it could trigger, and that would directly hit the food we eat and the technology we rely on.
And he really lands on this powerful thought. The real shock here isn't the war itself.
It's what the war reveals about how unbelievably fragile our global system actually is. We've built this entire world that's way more interconnected and, because of that, way more vulnerable than most of us ever stop to think about.
The analysis we've walked through today really suggests that these complex systems, the ones we count on for our food, our tech, our whole economy, they're all kind of balanced on a knife's edge. And it really makes you ask, can one single point of failure really bring the whole thing crashing down? Thanks for watching.